Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am seriously so thrilled you're here today because we're going on a really fascinating journey. We're going to trace a direct, literal line from the brutal, muddy power struggles of ancient Viking kings all the way to the technology sitting in your pocket right now and to the democratic structures that help shape our modern world. You know, we so often think of history in these isolated little chunks, but today we're looking at the ripple effect. We are going to explore how one leader's absolute obsession with control forced a massive migration that resulted in one of the most unique societies in human history.
So let's kick things off with something you've probably done 100 times this week, pairing your wireless headphones. Have you ever actually wondered why your phone's wireless tech is named after a 10th century Viking? I mean, it's not a coincidence, and it's definitely not just some quirky tech name. The creators of that technology wanted a name that represented the unification of disparate, non-communicating devices into a single standard. And to find the ultimate historical unifier, they looked way back to Scandinavia in the 900s.
Which brings us to Section 1, the king behind Bluetooth. Let's look at Harald and his father, Gorm. Now, to wrap our heads around this massive shift in Northern European power, we got to look at the physical evidence. These are the Jelling Stones. Scholars often call these the literal birth certificate of medieval Denmark, erected right between 953 and 965 AD. A chieftain named Gorm the Old, who's considered the ancestral head of the Danish monarchy, started this tradition with a smaller stone. But it was his son, Harald Bluetooth, who added his own massive monument to really show the world what it meant to be a big-time, ambitious Viking king. Visually, it tells an incredible story. It actually features the very first depiction of Christ in Northern Europe. But check this out. Christ isn't shown in your traditional Roman style. He's depicted in a distinctly northern way. He's bearded, garbed in the clothes of a Dane, and totally entangled in these serpentine ropes of Norse animal art, almost like a Norse dragon. It's literally two completely different worlds colliding on a massive piece of rock.
And carved right underneath that incredible visual is this specific text, translated directly from the original Norse runes. Harald won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. This isn't just some king bragging, right? This is a massive public declaration of a societal pivot. It marks the birth of a unified Christian Danish kingdom out of what used to be just a patchwork of independent pagan chiefdoms. But think about it. You don't just wake up one morning and convince a bunch of heavily armed Viking chieftains to hand over their power and abandon their ancient gods. That took some highly calculated, really ruthless strategy.
Section 2, the price of power. Securing loyalty. You see, early Vikings weren't ruled by absolute monarchs sitting on golden thrones. They were ruled by local chieftains. And the real foundation of their power was the housecarl. Think of these guys as elite personal bodyguards and loyal warriors that basically made up a private army. A king's power depended entirely on his personal reputation and his ability to employ these elite soldiers. If you couldn't gather men around you, lead successful military raids, and, most importantly, pay them exceptionally well, your reign was going to be very, very short.
So how do you fund that kind of fragile loyalty? Well, you hoard massive quantities of silver. But raw wealth wasn't enough on its own. They had to engage in highly strategic gift-giving. We're talking showering local magnates with golden rings, giving them swords with gold hilts, literally buying their allegiance. Then you add in strategic marriages like Harald Bluetooth marrying a Slavic princess to secure his borders. And finally, you utilize something called the leading, a forced conscription system requiring local magnates to provide ships and food for campaigns. Put it all together, and you have this highly transactional, incredibly high-stakes political game.
Section 3, forging a kingdom, building a nation. This whole nation-building process, it was incredibly systematic. Step 1, you subdue the local magnates and centralize their wealth. Once you've got the money, Step 2, you flex that newly centralized power through massive public works. They expanded the Danevirke defensive wall across the Jutland Peninsula just to protect against their southern neighbors. And finally, Step 3, to cement that absolute authority, they aligned with the powerful European empires to the south by enforcing a single religion, Christianity. They used the church's rigid top-down structure to reinforce their own royal rule. But as you can imagine, this heavy-handed top-down control created massive friction.
Section 4. Fleeing the kings, choosing exile over subjugation.
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of a proud Viking chieftain for a second. The king tells you to abandon your gods, pay tribute, and hand over your ships. What do you do? Well, many of them chose exile. 435, That is the exact number of initial, prominent settlers meticulously recorded in a famous medieval Icelandic manuscript called the Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements. This wasn't just a haphazard drift of lost sailors. This was a deliberate, highly organized mass migration of noble families, their servants, and enslaved people. They were primarily fleeing the increasing centralization of power happening back in Scandinavia, under kings like Harald Fairhair, and the continuing pressures that eventually led to Harald Bluetooth.
Just look at the timeline of this incredible exodus. In 874 AD, a chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarsson tosses his carved high-seat pillars overboard and literally settles wherever they wash up. He names that smoky geothermal bay Reykjavik. Fast forward to the year 900, and mass migration is in full swing. Keep in mind, Iceland was completely uninhabited before this, aside from maybe a few wandering Irish monks. And incredibly, by 930 AD, within roughly 60 years, all the arable land is claimed. They established the Althing, and the settlement is complete. They built a brand new society totally from scratch out in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic. Absolutely wild.
Section 5. A Tale of Two Systems, Diverging Paths.
Because of this massive migration triggered by that power consolidation back home, we basically get two radically diverging paths developing at the exact same time. On one side, we have the Danish kingdom, ruled by central kings, using top-down control, enforcing Christianization to align with Europe, and backed by the sheer military might of those housecarls. On the flip side, across the ocean, we have the newly formed Icelandic Commonwealth, governed by a cooperative of chieftains, heavily decentralized, initially holding on to their pagan roots and relying entirely on a legal assembly instead of an executive monarch. The settlers in Iceland explicitly designed a system to resist the exact type of king they had just fled.
And you can really see that when we break down the features of both places. The contrast is just night and day. Where Denmark had a central king, Iceland had absolutely zero central executive power. Laws were enforced locally by the chieftains. Where Denmark relied on royal decree, Iceland created the Althing, literally one of the world's oldest parliaments, where freemen gathered annually to recite laws and settle their disputes. And perhaps most revealingly, when religious tension finally threatened to tear Iceland apart around the year 1000 BC, the Althing didn't enforce some violent top-down conversion. Instead, they appointed an arbitrator who decided they would officially adopt Christianity to keep peace with Europe. But, and this is crucial, they allowed the private worship of pagan gods to continue. It was this brilliant compromise born out of a decentralized society, completely rejecting the forced conversions happening back on the continent.
So, here is a thought I want to leave you with today. Does centralization drive human progress, or does it merely force freedom and innovation to the outer fringes? Think about it. Harald Bluetooth's ruthless drive to centralize gave us a unified nation and inspired the name of the very technology that connects the globe today. But the resistance to that exact same centralization birthed the Althing in Iceland, a pioneering model of parliamentary governance that echoes in modern democracies everywhere. Both the king's ambition and the refugees' defiance powerfully survive into our modern day. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this changes the way you look at your phone and at history itself. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.